And I would like to welcome you to this Policy and Practice Seminar, which is hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy. It's quite a mouthful, really. My name is Dr. Cheryl Stroshine, and I'm a reader in politics in the department, and I'll chair this evening. The title of this evening's seminar is The Decline of Democracy and the Advance of Autocracy. And in essence, we're really wanting to consider the emergence of more autocrats and strongmen. 1 second, I have to just reset this. It doesn't like electricity sometimes. The emergence of autocrats and strongmen gaining power in democratic countries, as well as autocratic countries where power is being consolidated. And some of you know about those countries very well. What we want to really do tonight is think about that emergence, but also think about what we might do to protect against those forces. And if you're okay, so just to kind of recap, we're thinking about the emergence of autocrats and strong men. Unfortunately, they're usually men, but you could imagine a woman as well, a strong woman, that are emerging in democracies and creating situations of strong executives, as well as the consolidation of power in autocracies. And we'll think about that as well as whether we might be able to protect against those trends. What I'm going to do is give more of a bio as I introduce each speaker, but just to kind of give you a sense, we have Jennifer Gandhi, who will go first, from Yale University, Riza Hasmath, who is at the University of Alberta, and Gideon Rahman, who's Chief of Foreign Affairs commentator for the Financial Times. I am only chairing. I probably won't ask much unless I'm really inspired. Each of them will be speaking for 5 to 7 minutes, and what I haven't told them is that if they go too long, so I'll first raise a yellow piece of paper when it's 5 minutes, but if you keep talking over the 7 minutes, you'll get this paper. So that's a way. Also for questioners, if your question's going on too long, I might have to do this as well. You want to avoid that, right? It's embarrassing. So what I would like to do is just turn now to the speaking order. Oh, I actually, sorry. Let me recap again. I haven't chaired anything in a while. After they give their presentations, we're going to have a brief discussion among the panel members and then go to audience questions, with the idea being we should have a good half an hour for audience questions. So that's how we will proceed. And to introduce Jennifer Gandhi, go ahead and come in if you're out in the hallway. We would welcome you in. She's professor in the Department of Political Science and the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale University. Her research interests lie in comparative politics and political economy, with a focus on authoritarian regimes and transitions to and from democracy. Her work includes an award-winning Cambridge University Press book, Political Institutions Under Dictatorship, which I recently read and I highly recommend because it's extremely detailed and really interesting. She's also published in leading political science journals such as the American Journal of Political Science and the Journal of Politics. So, over to Jennifer Gandhi.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm just going to tackle a very small part of our topic, and that's really talking about the consolidation of power, the concentration of power within leaders in autocracies. If we think about dictatorships as essentially ruled by a small group of people, usually leaders, along with elites, whether they command military, financial, political resources, I think one key question in these regimes is what is the nature of the balance of power between the leader and the elites he's surrounded by? In some regimes, we perceive that relationship to be a little bit more balanced in the sense that elites play an important role in making decisions. They have ways of getting authoritarian leaders to comply with what they want. Decision making is a little bit more consensus-based, even if it's within this very small group of people. But there's another type of authoritarian rule that we often refer to as personalist rule, which basically implies that there is a huge imbalance between leaders and these elites. And as a result, it's the leader who's able to make really key appointment decisions to political power, to military positions, and as a result, also makes really key policy-making decisions. I guess most of the rest of what I'm going to say comes from the perspective of the cross-national research that has been done on this topic that basically has tried to collect more systematic data and information about personalist rule and the consequences of it, starting with the end of World War II up to the present. There have been some important developments in the collection of this information that really shows that these kinds of personalist regimes in which power is very concentrated within a leader make up anywhere from 20 to 25% of all authoritarian regimes, and that share is steadily increasing in time as we've seen the decline of party-based dictatorships, think the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of a lot of communist regimes, but also as we've seen the decline in kind of formalized military rule. There's been fewer and fewer military coups, so you have fewer juntas in power. So the decline in party-based rule, the decline in military-based rule has really created an opening for these personalist kind of strongmen types of regimes. The cross-national research about these regimes has identified really important differences in how the regimes behave, but also the types of outcomes that these regimes experience. So just to provide a few examples, first of all, we have some evidence that personalist regimes are more likely to be involved in violent conflict, whether that's interstate conflict or intrastate conflict. In interstate conflict, they're more likely to be the initiators of war. We also know that personalist rulers are more likely to use repression within their own countries. So both in the frequency of repression and the severity of repression, we see more of that in personalist types of regimes as opposed to party or military-based authoritarian rule. We also know on the development side that personalist regimes tend to attract less investment, both foreign and domestic investment. They also experience pretty wide swings in policies. You can imagine why, because you have fewer people involved in the policy-making process. As a result, policy can swing pretty widely according to the preferences of the leader. And as a result, we have very big swings in development outcomes. And I think, what we're probably all familiar with are these big sort of disasters that have happened under personalist rule, whether it's the Great Leap Forward or other sorts of big kind of development disasters. It's largely a result of this kind of unchecked rule. There's still a lot to try to understand, though, about these kinds of regimes. And so I'm just going to highlight two questions that are really kind of active areas of research for people who are investigating these types of authoritarian regimes. One is to think about, how do we know personalism when we see it? Like, what are the kinds of systematic indicators that really demonstrate that an authoritarian regime has become more personalist in nature? We have lots of really rich and wonderful qualitative accounts that point to particular signs. I mean, probably the most common one you can think of is, indicators of the rise of a cult of personality. So if you see portraits of a leader all over the place, or if everyone is carrying a little red book or a little green book in the case of Gaddafi, right? That could be a sign. But there are lots of other kinds of actions that indicate some kind of concentration of power. And here are a few. So it's often the case that autocratic leaders govern with some kind of ruling party. Again, a place to have elites, run in elections for the legislature, staff other sorts of important positions. But when a leader is really instrumental in setting up that party, as opposed to having inherited that party, that seems to make a big difference as to whether that party can actually act to constrain the leader's rule or not. So here, think about the contrast between like all of the Soviet leaders who came to power and they had this very developed communist party that they inherited, in contrast to Putin, who is instrumental in starting United Russia. That's kind of an important distinction, we think. Another sort of telltale sign seems to be the formal removal of term limits on executives. So there are lots of autocracies that have constitutions that look very democratic. Some of them include term limits. And you might, initially think skeptically, what is the purpose of these institutions and regimes that probably are not going to abide by them? But it's interesting that there seems to be, some sort of shift indicated when there is a formal removal of term limits on an executive. I think for folks who have looked at the Chinese case and, commented on it, it's like, my sense is that, when Xi Jinping, kind of basically made it clear that he was not going to abide by this norm, that there was a sense that the nature of the regime had really changed, and the balance of power between the elite and those around him had changed as well. I think another key indicator is whether leaders are able to appoint family members to key positions. Marcos, after the emergency, appointed his wife as mayor of Manila. Museveni appointed his son to become a special presidential advisor. This is a sense that a leader is able to control a lot of appointments. And then the second big question that I think we're still trying to understand is, how does this process of personalization actually happen? Like every dictatorship, when it comes to power, a dictator is supported by elites who help pave the way to power. And in some regimes, leaders are able to essentially marginalize the people who helped him come to power and concentrate power in these kinds of personalist regimes, and others are not. And so we're still trying to understand what are the conditions under which that process is able to happen, and when can elites or even citizens sort of impede that process of concentration.
That's great. Amazing amount of information in short time. Thank you very much. So we'll now go to Reza Hasma, who is a professor of political science at the University of Alberta. He's previously held faculty positions. Oh, I forgot my mic. Let me start over. Reza Hasma. Hasma?
Hasma.
Yeah, Hasma. Sorry. I should put on my North American accent. Professor of political science at the University of Alberta. Now you can hear me. He has previously held faculty positions in management, sociology, and political science at the Universities of Toronto, Melbourne, and Oxford, and has worked for think tanks, consultancies, and development agencies, as well as NGOs in multiple countries. His research has included projects on state-society interactions in China, what we just heard about, and multiculturalism in autocracies. And he's also editor-in-chief of the Journal of Civil Society. So, over to you.
Well, thank you, Thank you for the introduction. It's lovely to be here, and thank Dr. Fergus Green and the team at UCL for organizing this event. So, let me make no mistake about this. Autocracy is a dirty word. It's a dirty word in our societies. It invokes, as Jen was saying, an imagination of a single self-serving dictator, a small group of powerful individuals, a single party who are perceived to have absolute control. And this is contrasted to our own sort of Western liberal democracies. What I would like to suggest to you is that there are really very small amount of autocratic regimes in the world. We do have a plethora, of course, of anocracies. There are blended autocratic and democratic elements. What I would also like to submit to you is that we shouldn't be alarmed by what we misperceive as a rise of autocrats globally. In fact, what I would argue is that we've always had autocratic elements embedded in our government and societies at large. And I'll show that to you in two ways. And I guess you can see where my background's coming from when I say the first one. bureaucratic control mechanisms. That's the first thing I would like to argue. So again, speaking of another dirty word, bureaucracy. The Weberian bureaucracy has set the baseline of contemporary bureaucracies in Western liberal democracies. This is one predicated on hierarchy, specialization, and control mechanisms. In other words, the contemporary bureaucracy in Britain, in the US, in Canada, in Western jurisdictions have often embedded sort of autocratic elements of control in many respects. It allows for the political will by the government to be translated into the development and administration of policy via the bureaucracy. In China, this is a very similar situation. There's a very sophisticated authoritarian bureaucracy which has developed and executed policy. They support the government in play. Now, the question you might ask yourself, well, what's the difference between bureaucracy and a democracy versus an authoritarian environment? The answer, as Jen kind of alluded to, was the checks and balances. So that's one of the main variations that we see. So Western liberal democracies tend to have more robust checks and balances, whereas in authoritarian environments, it may be seen as not the case. So one of the advantages of having less checks and balances is that you're able to advance policy making to better your jurisdiction much quicker. So put plainly, if you look at China, of course they had the disastrous Great Leap Forward, but they were also able to use this advanced authoritarian bureaucracy to lift the majority of its nation out of poverty due to the sort of adaptive governance that was embedded within the bureaucratic sort of elements. So while the checks and balances were not the same sort of shape as Western liberal democracies, what we see is that they were able to engage in local policy experimentation, which allowed for having testing certain sort of policies. So it also allowed to reduce risk. So here, local policy experiments were conducted on a very small scale, particularly in the Chinese context. And if successful, the policy innovation lessons were scaled up nationally. Now, this has changed under Xi Jinping with a greater re-centralization of power and greater autocratic control. As a consequence, we are seeing less policy innovation at the local level, but we are still seeing policy innovation not being reporting back up. In other words, we're seeing that there is policy innovation in the Chinese context, except it's just not being reported back up to the central level, meaning there's a lot of innovation, a lot of innovative governance being tracked at the local level. Ultimately, what I would suggest to you, however, is that we are seeing autocratic elements not necessarily declining. It's just in a different shape and form. Now, the second argument I would make to articulate that is looking at the perceived decline of democracy and advance of autocracies from a value standpoint. So I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s. It was perhaps one of the best periods in human history since it was the end of the Cold War and the prevalence of a unipolar world with Western liberal democratic values spreading globally. It spread to the point where if I speak to my students, I speak to the current generation, they believe that these are universal values and norms. But expressed differently, we can suggest that there's always been various emphasis on values and norms globally. There is, for instance, an International Convention on Civil and Political Rights endorsed by Western jurisdictions, which basically stress freedom of association, freedom of speech. What we might forget is that there's an International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights endorsed by the old Warsaw Pact, i.e. the old autocrats. And they stress the right to food, shelter, clothing, basic economic needs of the individual. These values are not in conflict with each other, but they represent a different ordering and hierarchy of rights and freedoms and values. The right to have food perhaps may come first before having the right to free speech. So there's a different ordering of values in many respects. So this variation in values and norms never really changed as the role moves from this unipolar reality to one where we have more visible variation in norms and values. In some quarters, there might be a suggestion that we're returning to autocracy, but this is a mistake. It's always existed. It is better characterized as a world with greater economic polarization at a macro global level, and in a micro-domestic one, we see people expressing a different ordering of values. They want to eat first, put crudely, before entertaining what is perceived as luxuries of speech. So can we have both? Certainly. They are complementary. But for the everyday citizen, they are more interested in their daily lives and managing their cost of living increases. This has set the tone and space for autocratic tendencies to prevail, coiled in a rise of populism. So bureaucratically allows for a more nimble, faster responsive policymaking. It is manifested in a different, albeit temporarily, reordering of values and norms, more on the autocratic side rather than the democratic one. So to be very clear, I know I'm running out of time, the thought experiment should not be about the advance of autocracy, means a decline of democracy. It is not an inverse relationship. Just because we have more autocratic elements, that's evidence, it doesn't mean we have a decline of democracy. We've always had these autocratic sort of elements in our societies, structurally through bureaucratic decision making and or perhaps through our values and norms. The question we truly need to ask ourselves is how can policymakers and the governments of the day best be responsive to the needs of the citizenry who are facing increasing costs, declining wages in real terms, and are worried about the everyday. The alarming feature for me, the red line to begin worrying about, is if we move solely to an autocracy without checks and balances in Western liberal democracies, and I would submit to you we have not done so yet. Or if re-centralization in a jurisdiction such as China crowds out policy experimentation and effectively derails adaptive governance and policy innovation. And this is actually occurring to some extent. So that, for me, is the alarming sort of bits and the sort of red line we need to be thoughtful of when we think about this question.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a lot to think about as well. And I hadn't thought of that term autocracy in a while. So note to self, I have to remember it. So now I will turn, Mike is okay, I think, to Gideon Rachman, who is the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times, and he's been in that position since 2006, after a 15-year career at The Economist, which included spells as foreign correspondent in Brussels, Washington, and Bangkok. His third book, The Age of the Strongman, How the Cult of the Leader Threatens Democracy Around the World, was published by Vintage in 2022. And I have a feeling that you'll have more people buying your book as a result today.
That's why I'm here. Thanks. So thank you very much, and thanks to UCL for inviting me. Jen was saying in her talk that used the word systematic. I have to say my approach is, because I'm a journalist, not as systematic. The kind of nature of my job is I write about international politics. I travel quite a lot and tend to write about whatever the big issue in the news is. It's fun. It also has some advantage. I've met some of the strong men that I write about, a couple of them in person, Netanyahu and Johnson, who are relatively minor figures in the book, but Xi and Putin in larger groups. But perhaps more important than that, I often talk to the people around them and have a sense of how they justify what they're doing and how they view the world. And so around 2020, already in the beginning of the first Trump term, I thought it would make sense to write this book, Age of the Strongman. And the way I've structured it was to really go through them almost chronologically, starting with Putin, who comes to power almost too symbolically on the New Year's Eve, just before the beginning of the new century. And then proceeding through Erdogan, who comes to power in 2003, Xi Jinping, 2012, Modi in 2014, Trump, 2016, Johnson around the same time. Actually, the Brexit referendum is that same year, and then he comes to power a little later. And then others such as Duterte, Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman, etc. And they're quite a very eclectic group. So one of the things I had to try and answer is, well, do they really have anything in common? Since they span countries that are already autocracies, like China, to countries that are long-established democracies. And I was surprised, really, that actually the rhetoric used by these strongman figures, and they are all men, as you say, I don't think it's entirely coincidental. It's often quite a sort of macho, conservative rhetoric, socially conservative rhetoric. But the rhetoric is often quite similar across, albeit very different societies and different political systems. And I would identify two kind of central things that they are doing. First of all, as Jen said, the cult of personality is incredibly important to this style of leadership. So Trump, in his 2016 speech to the Republican convention, says, I alone can fix it, having described what he says is this American carnage. And in different ways, all of these leaders make this claim. So Putin, after the annexation of Crimea, one of his sort of henchmen stands up in the Duma and says, without Putin, there's no Russia. You know, Russia is Putin, Putin is Russia. Xi Jinping, as well as abolishing term limits, incorporates or gets incorporated Xi Jinping thought into the Chinese Communist Party's constitution, and indeed all the CP members have to study it. I remember being with a friend in Shanghai, and I said to him, you know, come on, you're not really studying this every day. And he said, oh, yeah, and he kind of unloaded his app, which was with Xi Jinping's thought on it, and then said, oh, no, it shows I haven't logged in today, you know, because I meant to study X amount a day. Narendra Modi in India, they just had the Cricket World Cup, and where was it staged? In the Narendra Modi Stadium, which I think is a slight giveaway when people start naming things after themselves when they haven't yet retired. And the destruction of term limits, again, which Jen referred to, I think is a very important sign. Erdogan did that, rewrote the constitution in Turkey. Trump has talked about doing it in the United States. Putin has extended his term in Russia. Xi has done it in China. So how do they justify this? Because they all do have a kind of rhetoric, again, in different ways according to context, but I think a really central thing is the evocation of a sense of crisis. They have to say, look, not only do I have a unique understanding of what the nation needs, but we can't operate by the normal rules because we are under threat. So we need a kind of state of emergency, and you need to put your faith in me and let me do what's necessary. Now, what that state of emergency can be varies country by country. Erdogan is a classic example in the sense that there is actually an attempted coup in 2016, and then he institutes a state of emergency, purges what he calls the Turkish deep state, a lot of people imprisoned, takes emergency powers and so on. That's a very sort of classic way of doing it. But for Putin, the emergency is that NATO is expanding up to Russia's borders, that the nation is under external threat. Xi has a sort of mix of external and internal threat, but again, quite recently said that China faces efforts to contain it from overseas that are reaching unprecedented levels, and that is why you need him. And also a rhetoric of humiliation, which is linked to this sense of national emergency. So Xi talks about China, often talks about China's century of humiliation. Modi has trumped that by talking about 800 years of humiliation for India, spanning not just the British Empire, but previously the Mughal Empire. Trump said, the whole world's laughing at us. People are looking down on the United States. And then once you have that, and I think usually you have a mix of internal and external enemies. You have the external enemies who are humiliating the country or taking advantage of it. Internally, you have a kind of traitor globalist class who are allied with the external enemies. And because they are so dangerous and undermining the people or operating on behalf of the globalists against the people, you need to give me these powers to capture them. And it's on my mind just now because I was saying to Jen that this afternoon I was at a seminar with a guy from the Heritage Foundation who are laying the plans for Trump's second term. And what they talk about is, well, America's been captured by this cultural elite, which isn't really not loyal to America. It's established an administrative state, which he said, he actually admitted is a kind of kinder, gentler version of saying the deep state. And the only way that we can really express the will of the American people, which Trump, of course, embodies, as do all these strongman leaders, is by purging the administrative state, getting rid of all those checks and balances, and putting in a new bunch of people, a new class of people who will respond to the leader. So that's a very classic way of proceeding. And if you can get away with it, I think the next thing to watch out for, if Trump were to take power, is does he try to demand emergency powers as a way of breaking through the checks and balances? And there is already talk in the US that Trump would try to invoke the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to deploy troops on the streets of America, and indeed it's believed that he actually did try and do that in his first term, but was blocked by very conservative figures like Bill Barr, the Attorney General, but who nonetheless believed enough in the Constitution to not go along with that. Well, I think in a second term, Trump would probably try and do that. So that is something to watch out for. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right. Let's give them a clap. Huh? I want to really thank you for all keeping to time, because it's such a short time to allow for discussion. And so now we can actually have a discussion. I would like to first turn to the panel members to see, would you like to react to anything that the others said? And it's okay if not, but...
Well, I have both a question and a kind of challenge. So the question would, Jen, you said something very intriguing when you said that these personalist leaders tend to initiate wars. And why is that? What is the connection? Is there any kind of research on that? Because in fact, when I was completing my book, it sounds a bit awful, but kind of was, the topic became much more urgent because Putin invaded the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I thought, I put so much stress on threat to democracy internally, and I wasn't really thinking about the external international relations consequences of it, which are becoming much more apparent. Does this style of leadership lead to, to international conflict? But no, I mean that's it. I mean for the rest, I guess I was thinking. No, I mean I'll leave it there. That's fine. Yeah.
I think it's sort of related to your comment about crises. I mean, being in conflict all of a sudden becomes a reason to not change horses midstream for any reason, right? Yeah. And more than that, to perhaps provide emergency powers or other sorts of forms of concentrating power in order to get out of that self-made emergency in some sense. And probably there's also an attempt to kind of rally people around the flag as well. So it could be kind of a mix of motives, but probably related to this idea of crisis.
Yeah, and I wondered, actually, answering my own question briefly, whether they develop a sense of sort of megalomania and a sense of national greatness, and then they identify themselves with the state. And I think that might be something that's happening with Putin, that after a while he begins to think about his place in Russian history, apparently spends a lot of time in the Kremlin archives during the COVID thing and says, okay, I'm actually the heir to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great here, and I need to reverse some of the humiliations that I've spoken about.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that, there's probably some element of that, and the issue in these regimes is there's nobody kind of equal or sort of strong enough to point out, hey, maybe doing that is not a good idea, and the war might not go the way that you think it's going to go, and et cetera.
Yes, Lisa.
I mean, I'm just thinking about the bigger picture. Are we really seeing a decline of democracy? I'm just thinking about it from a global terms. Yes, we can point to Russia. Yes, we can point to Turkey. But in global terms, are we actually seeing a decline of democracy and a rise of autocracy?
Well, you're the political scientist, so you probably have a better grasp of the numbers.
I do, actually,
But the ones that I've quoted, maybe you don't believe them, though, or think their methodology is flawed or whatever. But Freedom House, for example, say very much so that I think they say there's been a global democratic recession starting around 2006, and it's been going steadily since then. But you look skeptical. Do you not like that?
I'm very skeptical because I do believe we've always had autocratic tendencies in all societies. So when I was talking about bureaucracies that most jurisdictions would have in some form, it is inherently an autocratic sort of elements instilled within that bureaucracy. Now, it might seem very teeters for me to suggest that, but it is the reality that we have in all bureaucracies.
See, I'd resist that. Having seen some of these societies slide into autocracy, I think you really tell the difference. I've got friends who've been driven out of Hong Kong who are in prison, friends who are in prison in Turkey, and there was a palpable change. They lost their freedom as a result.
I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to note that we've got a large N situation, which is about averages, and then a small N situation. So I study Hungarian politics, and so I think one of the things is we sort of can talk past each other. We're thinking of different categories, whether it's the large N average or individual cases. Anything else from the panel?
Can I ask you about Hungary then? I mean, would you say there's been a palpable loss of freedom? I can think of people who've left the country, and that there's papers have been closed down, and maybe fewer political prisoners. I don't know.
So Hungary, and I'm looking at Alan Rennick, who also knows Hungary, but I have had colleagues in Hungary tell me that it feels worse than under socialism. And I've also watched a newspaper I used reliably for research closed down. Mm-hmm. And all that's left are these sort of right-wing media outlets. The thing that I've been really surprised about, because I thought the Hungarians abroad, or the people I actually study, Hungarians in Romania, Slovakia, would pick up the baton and sort of keep this free media alive, and they haven't really done that. And a lot of that is because Orban pumps money into those communities abroad. So there's a lot going on there. So, but I will say one thing about Orban. He is an expert at keeping control. And if we want to understand how to keep control, looking at him, he's not starting a war like Putin did. He's more subtle than that. Yeah.
And in fact, the admiration of the Trumpist right for Orban is, I think, very telling. I mean, when Tucker Carlson moves his show to Budapest for a week, that tells you something.
Yes. Okay. So with that, let's turn to the audience. And I think, I think that, Alan, are you identifying people to ask questions, or am I?
You identify, and I will...
All right. So we've got 3 hands right clustered together, and that will... actually, I now see 4 hands. I am going to actually let Alan select from among the 4 hands since he's back there.
Okay. I saw the hands.
So we're looking for just 3.
I saw the hands to your right first.
Thanks. My question is about Britain and whether us, along with lots of other countries, had much more of a taste and a brush with authoritarianism under the lockdown situation. Was there a decline in democracy accelerated because of lockdowns?
Thanks. I'll be as brief as possible. It's mostly for Gideon. You mentioned autocratic leaders creating a sense of crisis. Do you think it would be fair to link that to how in populist regimes and in populist rhetoric there's often that sort of anti-elite sentiment that they use to rile up support?
Hi, I wanted to ask about the more global rise of authoritarianism that has been observed in, I'd say, the 2010s and definitely the early 2020s as we're going through them. Do you think that the more autocratic tendencies and autocratic leaders kind of praising each other across the globe for such autocratic tendencies is constituting an alternative to the liberal international order, or have we not reached that yet? And does this also mean that they're going to keep kind of praising each other's regional great power projects as they go through them? Thank you.
Okay. Great. On to the panel.
I mean, I think the lockdown question is a very interesting one because, I was conventional enough to think anybody who was opposing lockdowns was obviously crazy and it was all sort of wild populists who were opposing them. And I think as time passes, people are beginning to think, well, maybe was all that as necessary as we thought and rethinking it. But for me, it's quite an early stage of trying to think through whether, I would say it wasn't authoritarianism in the sense that it was passed by democratically constituted governments, and I guess subject to legal challenge and so on. But it was a strange moment. I mean, that you would have we accepted, massive restrictions on liberty relatively mildly. But I don't know what the others think about it because it wasn't just a British phenomenon. But on the populism, I think that there's a close connection with populism because. Again, I said, one of the central claims of these leaders is there's a national emergency, but the other is I represent the people, I understand the people, I sort of almost embody the people, so that sort of my technique doing the book was just sort of noticing commonalities and discourses in countries that I'd go around, and if you'd say to people, the backers of an Erdogan or of a Modi, it's a bit much, you kind of closing down this university or this newspaper or whatever, they would say, well, but you don't understand, you're just talking to the Delhi elite or the sort of Istanbul elite or the Washington elite, and they're not really the people. They're kind of a tiny fraction of the country. They don't understand it. My guy actually really understands India, Turkey, the United States, and he understands that the real people are being thwarted by these awful elites, and things have got so bad. That's what connects the emergency thing, that the elite have sort of so controlled the society that you need a kind of massive reset, and that's why you need this leader. So I think there's a really strong connection between the rhetoric of populism, which is about I represent the people, and the rhetoric of national emergency and the strongman rhetoric.
I think the question about lockdowns is really interesting, and it makes me think about, I think one of the primary challenges to thinking about how to combat backsliding in established democracies is basically trying to achieve some kind of consensus about what those actions look like. A slightly different example, like there was a conference of political scientists, maybe 30 people in the room, that got together right around the time that the Trump administration had put in place the Muslim ban. And we were talking amongst ourselves, and the question was, is this policy or is this action a form of backsliding, an erosion of something that's really core to democracy, or is it simply a policy disagreement? And these are like 30, 40 people who do this stuff for a living, and they couldn't even agree amongst themselves. And so that's just to say, I think your example of the lockdown question, there are lots of different kinds of things that democratic governments do where we're not really sure sometimes about whether it's eroding democracy or if it's just, I don't like what that government is doing from a policy perspective. The second bit about the anti-elite, I think there's a connection about how leaders who are able to create a really strong popular following, I think it enables them to sort of escape the constraints of elites around them. And I think you see that in autocracies. I suspect you also see that in democracies. If I think about Trump and his connection with particular voters and how that essentially cows a lot of the Republican elites to basically subsume their objection because he wields this card of this popular support. And so I think there's an interesting dynamic between kind of voters or the populace elites and the leader to think about, and that might actually cut across democratic and autocratic regimes. The last comment is I think there's always been an authoritarian alternative. I mean, I wouldn't maybe go as far as you that I do think there are actual real differences in regime types and how people experience political, social, economic life. But I think historically there have always been plenty of states that are autocracies. And they've always, either provided an example by sort of the policies they're able to implement when they're able to engage in radical reforms and achieve really important development outcomes, when they give money to states and allow those states to also behave autocratically. I think that has always been around, and I'm not sure I would say that that's necessarily a new thing these days.
So I think I'm more interested in understanding the conditions that's creating populism. In the 2010s to the present day, we're seeing wages in real terms declining. We're seeing cost of living increasing. And this necessitates a particular condition to provide populist policies, might have autocratic tendencies, but it also shows a shift between civil and political rights, which are about certain types of freedoms, which incidentally is what the Freedom House measures, to economic, social, and cultural rights. In other words, it's a fancy way of saying people are more interested in most around the world globally about their economic life, about the basic necessities of their life. And they're more interested in the sort of freedoms that are associated with that, which is, again, that right to eat, the right to have shelter, clothing, the basic necessities. And that's instituted within that economic, social, and cultural rights I'm talking about. So when we are measuring civil and political rights, we might see a decline in that. We might actually see an increase in economic, social, and cultural rights as a result of the fact that the conditions that's leading towards this populism is economically rooted.
Okay. Gosh, I got so fascinated by the answers, I stopped sharing for a moment. So let's try this side of the room and then come back so I'm going to let Alan pick, because I actually am nearsighted, so I'm going to use that as an excuse to let Alan pick the three.
Right, I'll go right up to the back first.
Thank you. My question is actually for Gideon, just because I'm quite interested in what you're talking about with Trump in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And this is quite a hypothetical question, but I just wanted to ask what you might envision a Trump second term might be. Very abstract, but considering how close he is to how the autocratic features he brought to the government, it's just really interesting to imagine.
I'm afraid it's not as theoretical as you think. I mean,
Reza, I'm really interested in that point you raised about how these collective rights, the standard of living questions, wrapped in populism, as you said, proves to be very potent with strongmen. But these rights have their roots on the left. And I was interested as to why has there not been a sort of corollary on the left, which has been as potent as that on the right. So I was wondering if you could bring up maybe the importance, how you see it, of the cultural agenda and of the pushback against multiculturalism and the so-called woke agenda, and how important that is to the rise of these movements.
Sorry, more practical question. I'm hoping that Gideon might be able to help us with that, because he knows South Asia quite well. South Asia is a quagmire, in the sense that India, which is a patchwork, I mean, it's a country which is trying to make itself a nation, because it's a patchwork with the British left behind. It's becoming a problematic entity in terms of democracy in the region as a whole. In Nepal, for example, India tries to interfere. It tries to interfere in, it's attempting to interfere in, it's continued to interfere in Sri Lanka for decades and caused havoc. And it's causing havoc in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is having an election in January. And of course, India is sending around its Tamil prime minister, foreign minister, to places like UK and the United States to try and stop criticism which is being leveled at that autocratic, by the personalized autocracy, which is in power in Bangladesh. So I'm just hoping, Gideon, you will pay some attention to South Asia, because it seems to me India is not a democracy, but a patchwork, which is attempting to establish itself as a nation. Because, for example, the name of the country is being changed from what the British established in Bengal in the 1830s. Bengal became India. From there, the patchwork, which was slowly being established through the resources of Bengal's money, India was being established. That is now being changed to Bharat, apparently, and also other things. With the founder of India, which Gandhi, killed by RSS, whose party is now in power, is now trying to annihilate his legacy, and so on and so forth. In fact, there's not a history being written in India. It's hagiographies being presented history. And in fact, the saddest part, Gideon, is this. Sorry, primarily because he is somebody I admire and I love
I'm
listening to him.
going to have to hold this up soon. So
Of course.
Yeah.
The point is that, publishers like Bloomsbury and others are publishing tomes. You wouldn't publish ISIS tomes, yet far right-wing Hindu fascists are being given chance to being published by Penguin and by Bloomsbury and so forth. This is really problematic. I wanted to raise something about Hungary and European Union, but I probably will have to.
Yeah,
Sure.
thank you. There's just so many people to speak. Do you know, I also realized that I forgot to mention we are recording this event. So if you are speaking up, you're on the recording. So that might actually feature as well. So I'll turn back to the panel.
Well, I'll have a go at those, but I'd also like to invite Jen and Reza, who both actually live in North America and also know South Asia, to answer them. But on the Trump second term, I mean, it's very much on everybody's mind. And I was just in Washington and mainly talking about foreign policy, but even talking to sort of Democrats who are in jobs in the administration, you get pretty quickly onto the kind of looming 2024 presidential election and the fears about what's going to happen. And I think the summary is that people think and are very concerned by the idea that Trump 2 would be very different from Trump 1, in the sense that when Trump came in initially, he may not even have expected to be elected. He was very unprepared, and he relied on relatively establishment figures, the former head of Exxon at the State Department and kind of mainstream Republicans. And he's now sort of turned on them, believing that they too were the deep state or incompetent or whatever. He's a very angry guy because he's facing 4 different criminal prosecutions. And he will staff his administration with with loyalists who are prepared to do his bidding much more quickly. So I mentioned that, for example, his former Attorney General, Bill Barr, refused to invoke the Insurrection Act. Mark Milley, the Joint Chiefs, also same business. Now, Trump is talking about putting Mark Milley, America's senior military officer, on trial for treason. And there's various names doing the rounds of the kinds of people who would be made Secretary of State, put in charge of the CIA, etc. And people's faces go white in Washington when you mention them, because they're A, unqualified, but B, they're the kind of people who would sort of do what Trump would want, so that he might become much more authoritarian much more quickly. He would certainly encounter resistance, some on the street probably, and some within what he would characterize as the deep state. But that, unfortunately, would be a recipe for conflict and turmoil in the United States. And I really don't think it's theoretical. I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, they're very discouraging. If you don't want Trump to be elected, he's doing well. The South Asia stuff, I'm afraid it's very kind of you to kind of big me up, but you're overestimating my expertise on what India is doing in its region. I think, though, that there's an element in which the West is very reluctant to look directly at what is happening inside Modi's India, because India is seen as such an important counterbalance to China. Although I do remember a couple of years ago talking to a fairly senior person in the Biden administration, and I sort of said, kind of open-ended question, what are you thinking about or worrying about that we haven't talked about? And he said, India. And I said, oh, that surprises me, because I thought you'd be turning a blind eye to that. And he said, because it's so important. And he said, well, in my experience, if you turn a blind eye to things, you'll eventually get a nasty surprise. And then that nasty surprise has come through with these attempted assassinations, or real assassination in Canada, and apparently another attempted assassination in the United States. Mm-hmm. And it's very awkward for the US, because they really don't want a confrontation with India, despite all the conspiracy theories doing the rounds in BJP circles about how this is all an elaborate plot to undermine the rise of India. On the contrary, the last thing I think America wanted was to have to take this on. But if somebody is trying to rub out your citizens, as Putin did in Britain, generally it's a bad idea to turn a blind eye, although it happens, but I think they feel they've got to take this up. But so that may create more of focus on, well, actually, what is the real nature of Modi's India? And actually, the desire to assassinate your opponents is another feature of strongman rule.
Just about the possibility of Trump, I think another thing to look out for is how the election is going to be run. Mm-hmm. A lot of features of elections are controlled by officials at the state level. A lot of electoral laws are determined by state governments. The actual administration of elections is conducted by local officials. And, as we saw last time, there is a lot of power in those people's hands. And whether they kind of handle situations appropriately, do the right thing, don't suck succumb to pressure or violence or threats is, I think, going to be an important factor in determining even what happens with the election. As we were talking about before the panel started, I think another key thing to look out for is the response of other Republicans, Republican leaders, not just at the state level, but also at the national level. I think as an American, one of the discouraging things is not only Trump, but the failure of people from the Republican Party to somehow rein him in. Again, I think part of it is just a lot of people in the party just want to win and get votes, and they see that he's a vote getter, and so whatever he wants goes. But until more people within that party are willing to somehow draw the line, it's very worrisome.
I really loved your question about the idea of economic, social, and cultural rights usually being located in left-wing philosophies. It doesn't mean that you can't have left-wing philosophies that are not compatible with autocrats. In fact, you can't have left-wing autocrats. It's perfectly compatible. In fact, in the Chinese context, I would even suggest there is a greater attunement towards that. I'm not quite sure about the latter part of your question, so maybe after we can have a discussion. But I think at the end of the day, if we're looking at the Chinese context, Xi Jinping is looking for legitimacy, popular legitimacy. And the fact that there is a reduction in economic sort of situation of the everyday citizen has meant that he has to reinvoke different kinds of left-wing ideologies to suggest that we need to address these economic realities, which are declining. And so, again, at the end of the day, the autocrat, at least in the Chinese context, needs legitimacy. It's not that it's unwielded power that he has, contrary to popular opinion. He has to hold his sort of administration to that legitimate sort of strategies rooted in populism.
Do you think there's more left-wing autocracy in Latin America? I mean, that's Cuba, Venezuela.
In name, definitely. I do think when they do appeal to the philosophies that accord to the population, you are going to see greater left-wing tendencies, at least espoused. If you actually look at the practice, however, it's a much different reality. Whereas in China, I think there is greater accordance to left-wing philosophies and the practice.
Great, we have time for another round. 3. I would like to flag this woman who looks so dedicated to her question in the front.
Thank you. So, I want to ask a question about the democracy backsliding from a discursive perspective. I mean, that's my immature thought. But when we talk about democracy backsliding, we are saying more about authoritarian, strongman, seize power, and something like that. But this is just my opinion. So, but my reading about this trend is that these populists, authoritarian populists, are trying to give an alternative definition of democracy. For example, the Orban in Hungary, he talked about illiberal democracy, or Xi Jinping in China, he talks about the whole process democracy. So in his concept, the whole process democracy is more about substantive democracy rather than the procedural democracy. So my question is, do you think the trend of democracy backsliding is also about the competition about the definition of democracy between the liberal democracy and the other types of democracy?
The democratic backsliding we're seeing and the rise in populism coincide with the rise of social media. So my question is, how important is social media in terms of cultivating the cult of personality of these strong men and the kind of brand that they create through this? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is a question which actually echoes the previous question on social media, because I think the internet age has actually brought to the decline of democracy because of the propaganda war in the social media and also the extreme views that had led to confusion for the mass public, and that's why they want a strong leader, and it paralyzed the democratic society. That's what we've seen in Hong Kong, the decline of democracy and the rise of the autocratic government.
Over to you.
Yeah, well, I was very interested by what you said about these countries claiming to be democratic. I mean, I'm tempted to say that countries that explicitly put democratic in their title are usually autocracies, as in the North Korean, the Democratic People's Republic, and the same in East Germany. The undemocratic was the DDR. But it is true that it's very interesting that, I mean, I think Reza was saying that autocracy is a bad word. Well, democracy is a good word, and therefore everybody claims it. Mm. They all say, well, of course we're democratic, it's just, you misunderstand our democracy. And that certainly is, I think, the claim made by China, that they have a different form of democracy, that the West has sort of classical liberal democracy based around individual rights, but they have a different form of democracy which reflects the will of the people, just in a different sort of way. I mean, some people will be attracted to that argument. I guess I'm, I hate people who say they're classical liberals, but I'm about to do it. But I tend to believe, prioritize the sort of political rights of freedom of speech, freedom to vote, etc., because I think I'm more skeptical than Reza. I mean, I agree that China's an interesting story, and it's not just, it's a fifth of humanity, so you can hardly say it's an outlier, but I think it's quite rare, actually, to see a society that represses individual rights over a long period and doesn't end up with some sort of kind of economic or / totalitarian disaster. And I think one of the interesting things that happened in East Asia, and that China seems to be, from my point of view, unfortunately, not emulating, is that you had countries like Taiwan, South Korea, which it is true, developed very rapidly as autocracies, but then made the transition to democracy, partly under American pressure, I think, at certain key points in their histories. And that doesn't seem to be happening in China, maybe because of the nature of the Communist Party, or because the US has no leverage, or whatever. So, yeah, that would be my view on that. And on social media, yeah, it's difficult to tell whether it's a coincidence that all this is happening in the age of the rise of social media, or a cause. I tend to agree that it's hard to pin down, but I think there has to be a connection. And it's partly because it's true, a lot of these leaders are very adept users of social media, or their parties are. Bolsonaro was constantly on Twitter. Trump was the Twitter president until he got banned by it. In a way that maybe FDR was the radio president, and Kennedy was the sort of very adept user of television. He was somebody who kind of got the dominant media of his era, and it is a media that rewards appeals to emotion, that rewards simplicity. So, it was 140 characters and so on. Similarly, Duterte, the Philippines election, was, I think, studied by some as the sort of one of the first elections where Facebook and fake news, frankly, pumped out on Facebook, was incredibly important. And the traditional media, my kind of people, were just bypassed. There were all these sort of false narratives out there, which were very, very powerful and went viral very quickly. And I remember being slightly appalled when I went to see Facebook in California and talked to them about this, and they said sort of en passant that, when during the Indian election they had embedded people in the BJP campaign, and they said, it was just client services, showing them how to use it effectively, had a pretty powerful effect. So yeah, I think what it does is that it creates the ability to live inside your own narrative universe, which remains sort of unchallenged. I'm aware it sounds sort of super elitist, but I think that the fact that there's breakdown of a media that commands some sort of respect for generally telling the truth by a bulk of the population is a problem when that happens. When people say, well, the mainstream media, I don't trust it, I just get my news from TikTok or Facebook or something, they're very vulnerable to these very exclusive narratives. And I think if the UK escapes some of this, it may partly be because of the retained power of the BBC to create a single narrative of at least some agreed facts, which I think is really important to a democracy.
About this question about autocracy and democracy and understandings of democracy, I mean, your comment just reminded me of a study that looked at a whole bunch of different global surveys that have been done around the world for several decades, in which ordinary people are asked a bunch of political questions, including how democratic do you think your government is? And most people in places that probably we or Freedom House would think of as autocracies believe they are living in democracies. And so I think it speaks to kind of the ways in which autocratic governments have often used this word to mean different things and suit their purposes. And I think that we see more of that kind of manipulation of the term in general. I think the comment and also Reza's comments for me raises this question about, like, is there value to procedural democracy, right? An understanding of democracy focused on elections and rights. Is there value to it if it can't deliver other things, like the economic, social sorts of outcomes that we might prefer? And I think a lot of people are sort of asking themselves that question, and sometimes turning away from democracy towards a strongman or some other kind of rule, precisely because they're discontent with what democracy has produced. Just to echo the point about social media, I think it's, from what I understand, a lot of the conversation has been about how social media has generated increased polarization because it basically allows people to live in their echo chambers. And that polarization, in turn, makes it easier for populists to come to power, essentially. And so I think there's been some work that sort of tries to look at that mechanism.
So let me be clear, China's not a democracy. It is, I think that's the accepted idea among contemporary academics who look at China. It's only usually on the fringes you see these conversations. They look at local village elections, or they look at very, very small pockets. The compact has often been greater economic development, and you suspend political rights in return. That's shifted in the last 2 or 3 years under Xi Jinping, whereby now the idea is that the average citizen needs to give back to society. And so they need to contribute more in terms of philanthropy, volunteer more, etc. So give back to society rather than that sort of economic development, which it's just relative to the relative to the political rights. In terms of social media, I think it's interesting because I sound tired because I am tired. I was just giving a talk today looking at the skeptical citizen in China. And in the studies that we've been looking at we've been doing a lot of surveys in China on this. And we're actually seeing a rise of skeptical citizens in China. And this is predicated a lot by social media in many respects. So I know it might be counterintuitive to your idea that the social media in China is well controlled, et cetera, but there's a plethora of ways in which one can get by this. You can use political cartoons, you can do memes, you can just talk directly. There is so many ways, but ultimately, this is a long-winded way of saying to you that we have an increasing skeptical citizen. We have citizens who are protesting by virtue of not even participating in civic life. They are, the lying flat movement among the youths, for example. So in other words, what I'm suggesting to you is, although we commonly believe that social media is a way in which we can have greater it could be to the advantage of the autocrat, actually what we're seeing is that, at least in the Chinese context, it's developing a more skeptical citizen. And I think that's something to look forward to, and how that changes the sort of social dynamics and political dynamics in China in the rest of this decade.
Yeah, no, it's certainly double-edged. I mean, if you think Navalny's main way of, spreading his message was via YouTube videos, which went viral. So.
So I have the bad news that we are now out of time. I'm sure we could continue to discuss this all night. But before we thank our speakers, I just want to flag that next week is our last event, and you'll see Alan Rennick up here. The title of that event is Could Citizens' Assemblies Improve Policymaking? So that's next week if you'd like to come. And do thank our panel with applause.